do want to acknowledge that for me, joining from UW Tacoma, that we are as a campus on the lands of the Coast Salish people, and very specifically the Puyallup tribe of Indians. And in general, as we have these roundtable conversations, sharing our appreciation for the stewardship of tribes since time immemorial and their continued leadership and advocacy to protect Puget Sound. Certainly today's work is really supported by the leadership of the Suquamish Tribe, which you'll hear more about. And so want to share our gratitude for that continued leadership there. With that, I am gonna stop sharing and hand things over to our fabulous speakers, Sono and Philip.
Again, to the Puget Sound Institute and the Salish Sea Science Roundtable for inviting us here. I am in Sono Hashisaki, and I've been working in natural resources and ecosystem recovery in Puget Sound and Washington State for many decades. And I have a background in forestry and landscape architecture. I've spent at least 10 years doing wetland science, and worked a lot with stormwater engineering, and then have been doing more strategic planning, community-based strategic planning with tribes, and have worked with various tribes throughout Puget Sound and the coast for the last 20 years. Philip and I have been working together for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, maybe more. And this presentation today on the role of simulation models really combines the knowledge and expertise that he has, and then the background that I have in trying to bring forward decision-making that is supported with science. So the first part of our talk today, I will talk about a template for integrating science in decision-making to 2099, and then followed up by the meat of the matter here, which is the modeling to strategically manage groundwater and stream flows that Philip will present. This first part of the talk, this template for integrating science and decision-making, I just show you that, I'm trying to advance my slide, but there we go. That decisions are future-oriented choices to address issues, and in this case, we're focusing on the environment. And some of the issues we know that we're facing are fragmentation, disruption, displacement, loss of structure and function. And yet this refers not just to the environment, it actually refers also to our human systems. And that's important because the condition of the environment is an outcome. We always try to plan for outcomes. This was an unplanned for outcome. But the condition of the environment is the outcome of human use and activity. And humans depend on the environment. So really what conditions affect the environment, and what do we need to know? So that's the framing for this decision ecosystem on the environment. And what we start with is, what's the problem today? And the Dalai Lama says, start where you're at. So in your local geography, what's the problem that you're dealing with? And what's the current condition? What affects that condition? On the environment side, it's the biogeochemical processes, but also human action and activities. So how do we know what the current condition is? And that's based on what the data tells us. So we've been monitoring, key parts of our systems, and we use that data to tell us, how things are. And that's important for this box on the right, the deciders, because the deciders have to make the choices and the decisions about what future we want. But they don't make that in a vacuum. And their responsibilities are broad and wide. So some of the questions that they have to deal with are, how do we meet the needs of humans and the ecosystems? How do we bring everyone along, and who's at the table? And that's changing, as we know. And how do we leave the most options and resources for the next generation? Because we don't know what they're going to encounter. It's certainly not going to be what we encountered. And who are our partners, and how do we share resources, knowledge, and experience? So these are already two key elements of a decision ecosystem, that we have leadership with principles and values as an underpinning for how and what we focus on. And we have a base of information that we can count on for as accurately as possible conveying what's happening on the ground. Then the next question, just thinking about if you're approaching any kind of an issue, if we say we got a problem today, well, what's the problem tomorrow? So it gets at the nature of how will things change? What is it that drives those changes? What are the trends, and can we identify scenarios that would be helpful? And specifically, you want to know what changes in your geography, and what would that future condition look like? So how do we know what's projected? Well, we're in the realm of having available to us process and change models that depend on actual data for what the data tells us about the system, and can we calibrate our models to best reflect what that data tells us at a point in time, so that there's some reliability for the deciders as to the tools and the approaches that we use in terms of the accuracy. And then the last question that we really have to focus on is, what should we do today for a better tomorrow? So what can we do that will be effective? How can we test the assumptions and possible solutions using simulation modeling? And how do we know when our assumptions don't hold, and what we do then? And then the last question that leadership really has to deal with on a daily basis, but in the context of looking to choices that we make today for tomorrow, is, what should we fund and implement today? And so that it depends again on monitoring, so that we can keep up with how things are changing, what the actual costs are, and dollars and human resources to undertake anything, and having the political will to fund what needs to be done. So these are the really 4 key elements of a decision ecosystem. And you'll see that the template that we've developed it responds to these elements. So a key part of our focus today is that we're focusing on the environment, and looking at all the way that different sectors of our human systems depend on water and land, and that what we need in that decider box is, we need the leadership from different sectors to come together, and the stakeholders in those different sectors, because they represent both experience and possibly the more vulnerable members of those sectors. So the community values are really important. They drive what we would develop as guiding principles. And going forward, where we know that climate change is coming and there's increased uncertainty, I think that having guiding principles is just really key, principles for adaptation. Recognizing that though the leaderships at these tables have multiple responsibilities and they have fixed mandates and targets and budgets. And we're trying to look for where there's openings for understanding and building cross-sector connections. So ag and fish and development and agriculture, and using those connections to develop scenarios that will help each sector look at the choices and possibilities for solutions that they might have. So this is the first look at this template. And what we have is we've describing the different domains. So there's the domain of the decision context where we have the leadership and the stakeholders. And we have the domain of science, which includes the monitoring and the indicators, the models, and focusing on trends and solutions. And that comes down, that what they produce comes down to policy and planning that takes the changes in the indicators they find and helps bring that information up to the leadership for them to understand, you know, what's changing, what's possible, what are the data and models telling us. And then the last domain is the operations, where we would actually get to doing projects. So backing up now and just looking at this decision context, if we're working with cross-sector land-based sectors, it's important that we have a table where we can have agreement about baseline conditions. And that's where every sector, you know, the sectors involved with the ecosystem or development or agriculture, they all have their data and models and indicators, and that we can agree on what they're bringing to the table, how we can make the interoperability and utility of what everybody has, and agree on which are the change drivers and understand the change drivers that affect each sector. And that is then affected by the indicators that are not just the quantitative indicators that come up from science, but that the leadership and this stakeholder group actually can send down other indicators that are important. So it might be like, how important is public awareness or public support? Who's the most vulnerable? What are indicators for that? How effective are we at doing our partnerships and collaborations? How can we demonstrate that? So there's indicators that are coming from each of these sectors up to this baseline condition, and it's also being affected by indicators that come down from the leadership level. Looking at the science domain, we have each sector has their targets and their indicators, and there's a number of they each have different strategies or classes or types of action that are possible solutions to helping them get to the targets, to move the dial on their indicators. So every sector has these, and what we're looking for when we do the simulation model is we're looking for how the indicators, all the indicators that are the key indicators, would be changed by actions. These action pathways, like E1 is one, say, E2 is another, how they might be changed for every year through 2099, and that's the power of the simulation models. Then we're also looking at, because when it comes down to it, it's the importance of the change in indicators that helps us understand what the trade-offs are between the different action strategies that we might adopt. And so the reason it's the same color as the leadership is there's loops that go all across this template where you need to take information back up and consider it. I just didn't want to put all the arrows in, but that's a key thing. And then when that those decisions are made, then we can develop portfolios of projects, and it could be portfolios by sector, or it could be cross-sector portfolios that can result in fundable 5-year project plans. So this is the heart of how the simulation models can contribute to the decision realm. And then finally, we come down to operations. They have funded 5-year project plans, and they both give us information, actually, how's it working on the ground, and the monitoring. That's where the monitoring happens, so that we know how our system is responding. So this is in the year 2024. And then because the simulation model runs every year up through 2099, the idea would be that you could compare the 2099 project projected conditions with in 2099, let's say we're in 2099 with the actual 2099 conditions that are described by the monitoring data. And at that point, you'd be updating your assumptions, your models, and your indicators, and you certainly would probably have new problems. Now, this is just showing us at the end of the line here, but we can look in at any time interval from today to 2099. So it's sometimes more useful at this higher level to have, midterm and long-term peaks at what the projections would tell us. And under the science side, what would be targeting and looking for under each sector would be, okay, now which strategy? So if it's 100 years, if it's 75 years from now, we're probably on, strategy 21, 32. And the idea would be that over that 75 years, as conditions changed, we would already have developed possible solutions that could let us say, okay, we're not under this scenario now. We're in a new scenario, and let's look at the solutions that we develop so we don't have to start from scratch. So policy planning is much the same, except that everything is updated. And of course, operations are still on the ground. Oh, somehow I jumped over one and I'm at 2030 now. And 2030, reason we put 2030 in is just that while you can have these peekaboo looks at, mid-century and end of century, it's important to be able to do this kind of nearer term projecting, because what we're also trying to do is find out where the thresholds are and when we cross them. And then also in this nearer term look, as you go through your simulation modeling, you'll identify critical opportunities besides new challenges. So it's worth it to look in the near term, the 5 to 8 year term, as well as the mid-century and end of century. And so this is just to show you what it looks like getting a little bit closer to the project that Philip will be describing, that this template is, you can apply it both in just one sector. This is all kind of a In the environmental sector, you might be looking at stream flow and targets and indicators for fish. Possible solution pathways would be something with riparian buffers, something with groundwater recharge. Under land use, the targets indicators might be focused on housing or infrastructure. And some of the solution pathways might be alternate zonings, changes in development standards. On the vegetation side, harvest, how much we harvest, where we harvest, if fire comes, fire risk and fire management, and then silvicultural prescriptions. And so there's indicators for each of these solution pathways, and they are late summer flows, peak flows, recharge, impervious surfaces, soil moisture, and these are the things that help us understand how the system that we're looking at is functioning. I think with that, I'm going to just pause here and just summarize that we believe that this template for integrating science and decision making can be scaled to a basin, can be scaled to the Puget Sound region. And so I think that it has a great utility in helping people understand a common way of proceeding. And with that, Philip, I am going to pass it to you.
Yeah, my name is Philip Murphy, and I'm a recovering modeler who's trying to get better. I started off modeling way back in the previous millennium on exotic particles through the lifetime of the universe, and then went off and joined industry for a while, did a lot of AI in Japan in the early 90s. I became very interested in the whole question of decision support and how people make decisions and what type of support you need to make decisions. I sort of focused on that when I came back to the States for a while, and then slowly began to become obvious at the turn of the millennium that some of the biggest decisions that are going to really set the trajectory of our societies going forward are around the environment and how we're going to survive climate change and other trends that I think we're all very familiar with. Decision support systems, particularly trying to build frameworks to make it faster and easier to build decision support systems. And the biggest one I've been working on for 20 years is the ecosystem management decision support system that was originally created with the Forest Service, and had been working with a group with them for the last 20 years on developing this. So I feel I'm making progress on the decision side, but more and more it became clear that some of the information that we need to make the decisions that we need are not percolating up to decision makers. And a key part of what Sono was trying to explain there is this template that we're developing. They were trying to make it a clear road between if we have the science and we have the monitoring data, and we can simulate how key processes like trees growing and water flowing and groundwater moving. And if we can simulate those processes, we can project what the future might look like under different scenarios. And then most importantly, we can look at how might those trajectories change if we make big decisions now about taking strategic actions from now into the future. And so that's the whole setup. And I met Sono about 10 years ago, and she introduced me to some amazing people in the tribes. And the thing that just blew me away was, having worked in an industry where it's hard to get people's attention for more than a quarter, to have people talking about 7 generations out. In fact, the person who challenged me when I first was talking about simulation was like, well, can you tell me what the Puget Sound would look like in 1,000 years? To which I had not a clue. But after some negotiation, we decided 2099 is a good target. And so that's a lot of what you're going to see here. So let me move straight into then. So to be able to generate some of what Stone is talking about, we need simulation systems. And one of the most useful ones I found is the VELMA simulation system. But and the work I'm presenting today is totally work in progress. I got drafted into this talk about 2 weeks ago. And the project will not be done for another couple of months, but I'm sure. So some of the results I'll be showing today are literally off the computer last night. There's some really interesting, we made some really interesting progress there. So the project itself is called Simulating Outcomes for the Future. And it's a tribe it's a project with the Suquamish Tribe. It's led by Paul Williams. And its aim was to create a simulation system for changes in landscape under climate change, with a particular focus on terrestrial habit for salmon. So you'll see a lot of things about late summer flows and so forth, and what I'm about to talk about. And then we want to look at if we can build a simulation system and get it off the ground and project out to the end of the century. We then want, as I said, to look at if we start imagining systematic strategies of actions, how large or small the effects will be, and when will those effects come into play. And that's sort of the key to this. But to build that, I need a simulation system. So I need to calibrate the system called VELMA. And I have to say the collaborators on this project have just been fantastic, and quite a few hydrologists involved, both from USCS and then Joel and Adam Massman, who work with the Suquamish Tribe. And I have to say that every wrong thing I say related to hydrology, it's all me. They have tried to teach me over and over again. So, you know, there's a lot of expertise there, and I've been working with Bob McCain, who I think a lot of people here will be familiar with, and his team, who are behind the VELMA software at EPA, and then obviously Sono and I are here. So let me just jump straight into this. One key thing I have to sort of spend a moment or two on is to talk about terminology. When we started the project and had a hydrologist in the room, we had to spend a fair amount of time before we all agreed on words that we would try and use consistently. So I'm not going to go into the four main things we need to understand for the talk is recharge. The idea that, you know, when rain falls and hits trees and hits the soil, some of it will run along the soil, some will go into the soil, and some of it may leave the soil layers, pass the root systems, and actually get into aquifers and other deep containment systems. Some of that will then leave the aquifers and reemerge to the surface through springs and other things and become part of the surface flow. Another piece, what we call the groundwater sink, is going to leave the groundwater reservoir and basically disappear. In the case of Kitsap Peninsula, a lot of that is because it's working its way into the Puget Sound, like through under the surface into like the Hood Canal. And a third term is that where hydrologists have very complicated things like groundwater reservoirs, and they model them with things like MODFLOW. The VELMA team, which is mainly up to now always focused on everything above that, rain falling, trees growing, water working through soil, nitrogen and carbon cycles, runoff flow coming into our stream systems. In the last 4 months, with version 2.2 of VELMA, we have this thing called the groundwater box, or a G box, which allows us to store water as if it was going into an aquifer in a very simple way. So we now have the flows of recharge, the flows of groundwater sink, and the flow of groundwater. We can mimic that in VELMA. We're not building a groundwater system. I mean, just everything I've learned about MODFLOW has convinced me that that's an incredibly complex world. But we can use results from systems like, look at the results from systems like MODFLOW and then mimic how they actually function. So this is what I'm talking about today. I can't go into much detail on VELMA. It's called the Visualizing Ecosystem Land Management Assessments. The main point about it is that you have a landscape, you cover the landscape with grids, with pixels. In the case I'm showing you today, everything's a 90-meter pixels. Every pixel has a vertical component of 4 soil layers with roots and trees and stuff working all the way down to the 3rd layer, and the 4th layer being sort of if you have bedrock underneath it, the 4th layer would sort of act as somewhat of a slow-moving aquifer. As water can flow, water can transpire to fall down from the sky. It can be evapotranspirated from the trees back into the air. It can flow from the one pixel to the next downhill pixel. It can accept, if it's a pixel here, it can accept water from an uphill pixel. So water and nutrients are moving through the soil layers, and all these processes are integrated within VELMA, which is what attracted me to it in the first place. Typically, what you get out of VELMA is it uses a day time step, and you know, a lot of time we spend our times. We have the weather driver information that tells us how much rain is falling, what the air temperature was. So may fall as snow, may fall as rain onto the mountains, and then it moves through the landscape, and usually hits some point, hopefully quite far down, where we have a gauge. And so in these diagrams, the blue is the USGS gauge down at Seebeck. I'm talking all the way through. I'll be talking about Big Beef Creek, which is I'll just use in a sec. So, but that's down. But this is typically from of the many things that VELMA does. It gives you soil moisture maps. It gives you temperature. It gives you biomass growth. A lot of times I'm focusing, because of the salmon side of it, on flow. And so what you're looking for is, does your daily simulated flow match pretty well with the observed flow over a long period of time? And if we can calibrate our model by changing the many parameters into it so that we can optimize this match, then when we project out into the future, we have some confidence that it's somewhat relevant to what might happen out there. One key thing, this is just a log of this matching, and I just want to bring it up from the start, because one of the key things I mentioned a number of times through here is, again, with salmon, late summer low flows are a major concern. And the models that we built originally, Sono and I designed a project that happened at Tulalip for about 2 years, and that's where I worked a lot with Bob and his team. Our late summer flows, we continually underestimate the amount of water in late summer, which is pretty impressive, because we know we've already got pretty low late summer flows. And in fact, our simulations consistently always had too little water in them in late summer, despite many attempts to fix that. Is one of the things that inspired today's work. Because at its core, if you think about it, if you look at an annual basis and try to figure out where all the water goes, I mean, the water that falls out as rain either is going to get transpired back into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration for the trees and plants, or it's going to go as runoff along the surface, or it's going to get involved in the whole groundwater system. And the groundwater that leaves our surface and goes into the groundwater system, or groundwater or recharge, will eventually become one of two things. It'll either become groundwater flow that will come back to the surface, as I mentioned before, or it'll become a groundwater sink and disappear entirely out of our system. And there are other things like sublimation with snow and stuff, but down the Kitsap, we're not too worried about that. The key to this is that for many years, VELMA has always been run as if there was always a magical groundwater layer underneath that fourth soil layer. So the water never left the soil layers. But we know that on the Kitsap, it's all aquifers all the time. And so what happens when you ignore groundwater, if you just leave that out, is that that proportion, particularly the water that should have gone into the groundwater system and not reappeared into the stream system, that will have to be essentially accounted for by artificially increasing evapotranspiration. And so a lot of and VELMA is very, very sensitive to evapotranspiration. What you're seeing on the right here, these are just graphs. Again, blue is observed on annual flows, and the orange thing is the VELMA simulation flows. And if I drop the key parameter essentially sets your evapotranspiration rate. Once I've dropped it by half, we move from a world in which we didn't have enough water, at least from the gauge's perspective. There wasn't enough water reaching the gauge. By the time I've dropped it by half, I now have more water than I should have when I reach the gauge. So VELMA, I mean, this question of getting your evapotranspiration rates correct is really key. And if you're ignoring groundwater, that's going to be very difficult. So in essence, coming into this, there are four sort of key issues around the models that we've been working up in the Snohomish Basin that we knew of, because a lot of the models were, a lot of the area we were covering was very high up in the mountains, in which case aquifers are not in play. But we knew that a couple of things need to be fixed. We took those models and ran them to see how well they worked down on the Kitsap. And we discovered that our match, which can be measured through a thing called the Nash-Sutcliffe coefficient, that's how one daily hydrograph matches another daily hydrograph. You'd love to get an answer of like 0.8 and above. And we were down into a very middling 0.64. And again, that thing I said to you before, we found it the late summer low flow problem is even worse. Our simulations are so bad, have so little water in the late summer. And although we know there is not a lot of, we'd like to have more water in late summer, we're way below observations. And finally, on the ET stuff, when I look at the models and when they ran down here, they should be, the percentage of things of precipitation is a good way to think all the way through and these problems when you're trying to understand what's happening to water balance. And the ratio of evapotranspirated water to overall precipitation for the Western Cascades should be usually somewhere around 0.2 to 0.4. And we were at least twice that, so well off it. So these were some of the problems that we were hoping that by directly taking into account actual groundwater, we might be able to do something here. As I said, everything I'm talking about is on Seebeck, which is this watershed that runs south to north and drains into the Hood Canal. I have a lot of slides here, which I'm not going to be able to get to in any detail. You'll have access to the slides afterwards, and so I'm just going to sort of, show a slide, mention one or two things about it, but I'm only going to focus on 2 or 3 slides so that we can get to the end of this and give you an idea of what we did and what it might mean. So I'm going to, full apologies, but the main things that the model, this was the MODFLOW model, the USGS model was published in 2016, and we weren't asking them to rerun that. Andy and his team, what they were helping us was to take the results from that so that we could use them to try and calibrate our VELMA model. So we have from 2005 to 2012 a fully calibrated model that runs on a monthly time step. VELMA is a daily, but MODFLOW is a monthly time step model. It covered the whole of the, and I'll give people reference, of course. It covered the whole of the Kitsap Peninsula in a grid of 500 by 500 foot cells. The fantastic news to me when I was talking with Andy and those guys was that although there was like 5 incredibly complicated interacting reservoirs, all I needed to ever know was what happened at the surface, how much water goes in, how much water comes out. And they were able to give me that information from the existing model. So the information looks something like this. This is the outline of, in red here, of Big Beef Creek catchment area. This in terms of recharge, very high areas of recharge in the MODFLOW model are in the reds and oranges, and yellows and greens not so much. And you can see that they follow along the main course of the Big Beef Creek. But some of the other attributes here, this is because of how they developed their recharge model, which if I have time I'll go into a little later. It's not actually a key component of MODFLOW. It's more like a boundary condition into MODFLOW. But it was pretty clear that if I summed up the numbers that MODFLOW was seeing when they're in their study, and the MODFLOW model was built on a really extensive amount of field work that was also done by USGS on the Kitsap Peninsula. And some of the things where it's pretty clear that, as I said, about 30% of all the precipitation is probably going into the groundwater system across the peninsula. So it's pretty clear that it's a key component of the water balance. In terms of the ground flow, the water coming back out of the aquifer system and back to the surface, you can see that in Big Beef Creek, from the MODFLOW results, see that is really just happening almost exactly along the stream beds, which is not a surprise. But it also shows you that while many pixels are contributing to the recharge, a much smaller number have ground flow coming back through them. After many meetings, what I'm taking from the MODFLOW model is in fact incredibly simple in the way that we're doing the integration in terms of calibration. We look at the overall precipitation on average for the years that we're looking at 2005 to 2012. Look at the average recharge, look at the average ground flow that the MODFLOW model suggests for Big Beef Creek. And then you can see that, if precipitation is 100%, about 39% of the precipitation was going into recharge, and about 70% of overall precipitation is returning to the surface as groundwater flow, which also means that of the recharge, the groundwater flow is about 42%. So these are actually the numbers that we actually used to connect the 2 modeling systems. So we didn't go pixel by pixel. We're doing at the watershed level, continuing along. When I look at the MODFLOW results for the entire Big Beef Creek catchment area, there is your recharge in blue, and there in orange is the your ground flow. The observant people probably notice a very flat piece here, but it turns out that the way the MODFLOW model was set up, it's assumed that from May to September there is no recharge. Apparently that helps stabilize the model. Okay, I'm not. So the whole thing is that in the last couple of months, VELMA has, the new VELMA 2.2 has given us the ability to mimic each part of that. I can have recharge, and the recharge of VELMA is quite brilliantly done, is that I can set that a portion of the water that's flowing, if the fourth, for every pixel, if the fourth soil layer is saturated and water, which means water is going to push from it's the third layer, I can set a percentage of that water to be diverted into my groundwater reservoir. And I can do that using a map. As in, I can set for every, I can decide what that fraction will be pixel by pixel. And then from the Gbox, I can set how much water is leaving every day, and that can be split into actually many. I can send it to many different pixels for reasons I might have time to get into later. I'm only sending it right now. I'm saying all of the outflow either goes straight to the gauge point at the bottom of the stream and contributes to the measurement of the flow at the gauge point, or it goes off-site. It's that groundwater sink that's gone from us. And so the basic way gone with the integration, and I'm going to wrap up in about 4 slides here, is basically we first ran VELMA without groundwater the old-fashioned way. Then we started experimenting with turning on the groundwater recharge into the Gbox, and then experimenting with different values of the outflows to see. And the key was to see if we can have VELMA replicate, now that it has the capability, the same ratios that we pulled from MODFLOW, the recharge and the groundwater, recharge to precipitation, groundwater flow to precipitation. I'll skip over this quickly. There's a tremendously useful map from Kitsap County that looks at where water can easily get into aquifers or in deep soil layers. I use that as a template for which pixels in VELMA would directly contribute into the Gbox. All the others are still, so this is on the 1st of January 2005. The simulation says that the heaviest concentration of water flowing into Gbox are in these darker cells. But keep in mind that all of these lighter cells are still pushing water cell by cell downhill towards the river system, and many into these cells until it hits a cell that it can go into recharge. So they're still all contributing. I'm going to skip a few. There's a great, okay. So what you're seeing here essentially is the core outcome of this thing, is that with this setup and with using MODFLOW as a guide, in the dark blue, you've got MODFLOW's recharge. In the dashed blue lines, you've got MODFLOW's groundwater back to the surface. In the orange, you have VELMA's recharge, like in the map you just saw. And in the orange dotted line, you've got VELMA's estimate of groundwater flow. And so by matching our parameters and so forth, I've got them to be pretty much in sync. So that these numbers I mentioned before, these become the guiding way that I know, am I finally getting the groundwater amounts about right that are flowing in the system. So just to jump right back to where I started, have we improved it? Yes, we've gone to a more respectable match on the straight hydrology. The huge gain for me, which I'm so excited about, is that if you look at the low flows, yeah, we still goof up every now and then, but we are much more in tune with the observed late summer low flows than we have with any model we've had before. And on the in the evapotranspiration and precipitation ratios, we are back in the green in terms of the type of ratios we'd expect to see in the Western Cascades. Well, I should, of course, there's the reason for all of this, just to get what connects us back to Sono, is that VELMA can spew out a humongous number of different indicators. Particularly with post-analysis, I can look at trends in low flows, peak flows, max summer stream temperatures, a bunch of critical things like for salmon, because I'm focused on that particular sector in Sono's picture. But this can also be for housing. It can be for peak flows and storms, etc. I can get maps of growing seasons, days under snow, frost-free days across, and at the end of the century. So it's this ability to estimate changes in indicators due to accident and trends. That's the whole point of all the work we put into calibrating this. I'm going to skip over limitations. There's plenty. We have next steps. We're not quite finishing this project. The thing I wanted to finish up with is simply back to this, which is the larger applicability here. MODFLOW, everyone tells me who runs it, is difficult to set up. You really have to be a good hydrologist. You really got to know your stuff. So we're not likely to have MODFLOW models available to us across the Puget Sound. But in the all these other, these are some of the, I think there's a picture from the Puget Sound integrated modeling framework of all of the many basins that Bob McCain and the team are busily simulating right now and calibrating at the moment. And so the question is there any way, especially when you get down to lower areas where you know that groundwater is going to start mattering again, is there some way that you could actually get this same little table without a MODFLOW model? And the answer is actually, I think, perhaps yes. As I said, the actual precipitation, the actual recharge amounts that were used in the MODFLOW model were not an outcome of the model, they're an input. They used Bidlake and Payne. So there are ways to figure out that recharge number that it doesn't require MODFLOW. In fact, MODFLOW requires that to be done first so it can run. And then on the other key element, which was the groundwater flow back out, there's an amazingly interesting tool from Chris Conrad at USGS called the base flow separation tool that looks essentially at basically looks at, oh, I don't have a great one here. It separates sort of the continuous base flow, like if there's no rain for 3 months, what flow would you still have in late summer? And it uses machine learning across 13,000 gauges in the United States to estimate what that base flow is. And the really interesting thing, and I've just done it for Big Beef Creek, so when I've done a few more creeks, I'll know if this was just a happy coincidence. But the black is the base flow separation flow annual thing for Big Beef Creek. And the green is the MODFLOW's groundwater flow. And the two line up pretty well. So perhaps the base flow, I did run this by Chris and said to tell me, to stop, let me know if I shouldn't say this. Is it like insane that this could actually be a good proxy for a groundwater estimate? He said, no, it's not impossible. Could be useful. So the question is there. So, but if we have that, then the point being is that you could, you don't have to pray that the gods smile on you and a MODFLOW team descends and you can get them to do it. You might actually be able to finish with this.
I think that's a great takeaway, Philip. And I'm going to pause this there because I do want to make sure we protect some time for Q&A. And I know there's a lot of great nitty-gritty details that make the magic of this modeling happen. I'm going to invite folks to drop questions into the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you. But I think particularly what I appreciate about that as a not modeler is that you all have shown the value of connecting groundwater and the importance as we think about management decisions, but have also shown that there are possible ways to do that can get off the ground faster if MODFLOW is not available. And so I appreciate the practical lens of that. And I see a kind of a theme through some of the questions folks just shared in the intro as they were jumping in, which is just kind of curiosity around kind of the management questions that this might inform, and particularly around reconnecting groundwater to surface water to both maintain flow, but also to think about temperature. And so curious if you can reflect on the types of management questions that are being considered and any insights you have from the modeling thus far or are excited to explore. You can rock, paper, scissors.
Go ahead, Philip.
Oh, wait, sorry. I thought that was a question to the general community to throw stuff in there. And I got sidetracked by a question in the chat and I was like, oh my God, okay. I'm sorry.
You're good. Management questions that you're excited to explore as scenarios in this and or that you have any insights into from initial results thus far.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's a great one. And, one of the, and I'm going to refer to this earlier project with Taleo a little bit too, that, sort of we got this on this, we were looking at in that project, one of the things we were looking at was if you change forest practices, what would that do for late summer low flows, over through the end of the century. And one of the things that became very clear here, we were looking at, for instance, like putting snow bowls, cutting 200-meter circular things in a forest so that snow would fall in them because that snow would melt more slowly and give us a longer discharge. But one of the things that became clear was that by mid-century, there really isn't enough snow. So we did find a signal that, yes, it would definitely help a little bit. But by mid-century, there just wasn't enough snow up in the in the mountains above the Snohomish. So this question of understanding, like when is an action appropriate, and how long does it take to put that action into effect? And then when you have done that, how long will it be effective? And when it stops being effective, have you already thought through like, well, okay, what else can we do for late summer low flows, you know, and to be already planning on those, particularly if you have to build like reservation water, what do you call it, water holding systems, you know, that may take 20, 30 years to get the permits for that. So, so yeah, there's the time aspect of this is what really intrigues me as we try to figure these strategies out.
Also, the cost, like if you start looking at retention, the cost of the land and the actual time it takes and everything. But I do think that in systems like the Kitsap, it's very interesting to look at the storage. What does storage potential do for a system like that? Because all of our systems in the Cascades are going to lose their snow eventually. So they'll be more like the Kitsap.
Right.
Great. Thank you both for those reflections. And looking at another question here, which is, how do you intend to test those policies with these new tools? And how precise do you feel like the results need to be to inform some of those decisions and get traction? So thinking about the confidence and accuracy piece of
yes, that's always a great question. You know, in my working out in the business world before, software got used by, didn't see it as an intended use, but it's a multi-criteria decision software. So you're looking at, you know, different objectives you're trying to achieve simultaneously. And a set of companies picked up the software who had discovered something really bad leaking out of their factories. And so they were using for waste for trying to figure out what are like they were suddenly facing 4 or 5 incredibly expensive futures and maybe going out of business. And so they really, you know, they really were focused. But typically some of the key things they needed to understand were not actually their areas of expertise. It might be great at making boats, but know nothing about what's killing off the fish, you know, in the stream nearby. And one of the aspects of this that I came away with is that often when we're trying to make decisions, we are too focused on the accuracy. And instead of, well, hey, we can't build a perfectly accurate system, so let's just spitball this and say, you know, we'll go this way and not that way. And so part of what the whole point about these templates is that they're meant to be interchangeable. So like if we use VELMA today, if there's, Bob, don't take offense if you're on the call, if there was a better tool tomorrow, you know, we swap it in, swap it out. The whole thing is to try and push the envelope simultaneously in the best directions that we can. So when you talk about testing this, yeah, it's exactly what we'd like to do. So for instance, if I take my godlike power and I put riparian buffer zones across every stream, what I want to understand is, will it make a big difference or just a small difference? Because in many ways, this is one of Terry Williams, a person from the Toledo de Sono introduced me. That was a guy that said, can I tell him what's going to happen in 1,000 years? His point was that there were many ideas that we have that even if you could do them perfectly and no one, you know, and you had all the money in the world, they might not make a difference. So let's get them off the table so we can focus on those strategies that really might make a significant difference. And so that's part of what we're trying to test with this stuff is, you know, if we do extreme actions, in theory, not in practice, you know, how large an effect will they have? Can they even match climate change? That was one of the things. If your late summer streams are heating up, and you have a very expensive set of actions that you're willing to look at, can you even catch up with climate change? Or in fact, you know, because if not, we've got to think more broadly. You know, so that type of broad testing is what we're doing at the moment in this round.
And then another point is that even with the most accurate modeling, it's a slice of the whole nature of the problem. Right. If the human system side is driving the conditions. So if we can provide this information accurately in a way that a better communication and story can be shared with the leadership and the public, it just will inform, it just provides a higher base of common knowledge. And that, I believe, is really critical.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the agreeing on what baseline conditions were and building from shared values that you talked about earlier so that you can be adaptive as new information comes on board. We have some great questions in the chat. We will not get to all of them. So I'm going to ask that Sono and Philip, maybe we can follow up over email with some of the folks on these. But I guess one of the questions here that's broader than some of the modeling nuances. It's just the applicability of this to other communities. The example specifically was Bainbridge Island. And so kind of any words of wisdom you would have for others who are looking to similarly understand their groundwater dynamics.
Well, looking at Bainbridge, I think is falls within the Kitsap buffalo model, so you've already got a great start, you know, and I've got a bunch of scripts and stuff that synthesize the MODFLOW outputs and stuff, and I'm happy to share those with anybody, so you could jump right into it. And I'm glad you mentioned this because this is one of my absolute obsessions, is to build transferable systems. So one of the things that Sono and I've also been working on is knowledge graph. Around research environmental work. And so what I'm trying to do in that is to fully document the models, what exact data sets we use, how to, VELMA requires 7 or 8 different data inputs. What exactly are they, and what did we use here on this part of the Kitsap? So somebody coming along should be able to interrogate our knowledge graph, get almost exactly what they need, and then hopefully you can just simply have to cookie cutter their data, because most of the data sources are state and national data source. So yeah, everything we're doing so far is incredibly transferable, which you can see in the fact that Bob McCain, they're actually doing VELMA for the entire Puget Sound, every single watershed.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate the thoughtful discussion and all the collaboration that has gone into, and late nights of coding like last night, that have gone into not just this conversation, but the broader conversation that this is a part of. So thank you for sharing the fruits of your labor, and clearly lots of interest. We will post the materials. We will follow up on some of the questions. And then I will just also plug that next month, we will have our next roundtable on eDNA in the Salish Sea on the 7th. So drop the chat in there, but hope to see many of you back. Thank you all.